Those who were with me last night know that I was attempting to drown my sorrows and pretend that what happened last night wasn't going to happen. And those who were with me until the bitter end know that I even failed in successfully doing that, because instead all that happened is we walked around for hours and hours. Nothing was open. And it was one of those nights that should have been called 2 hours before we called it. And those who did call it 2 hours before woke up in the morning feeling a lot better than I do right now. And I want to address the future challenges of extremism in the context of what's just happened, because I think it's going to have a profound impact. Building up on what Hazel has said, who never fails to inspire and lead the way in this debate, and on Professor Muqaddam, who insists I call him Ali and I refuse to, out of great respect and endearment to his intellectual prowess on this subject. I want to comment just to offer you some guidance on the consequences of Brexit on the security debate. I wrote a column, which I have a weekly column for the Daily Beast, but I now also have a monthly column for a liberal Jewish newspaper in the United Kingdom that's called the Jewish News. And I advised in that column that us remaining as Britain in the European Union is better for our security. But I want to now assure you that though I think it would have been better, I agree with Hazel, and I endorse her remarks. I don't think it's going to negatively affect our existing security cooperation in too much of a way. So there is a cause for optimism that the vote last night will not end the existing bilateral cooperation between Britain and France. It will not end the way in which Britain can offer its security expertise to European countries. Why would it? Because leaving the European Union doesn't change the fact of geography that we remain neighbours, and that cooperation is in everybody's interests. So fear not. The fact that we have, and it's globally recognised, I'm not just saying this because I'm from the United Kingdom, the fact that we have one of the best security services in the world in relation to dealing with the terrorism threat, the continental Europe will still benefit from some of the training and expertise that the British can provide in this area, and we still will gain from some of the expertise that continental Europe has on the security question. I also think, despite the fact that the pound closed at one of its highest the day before the vote and then dropped to lower than 1985 levels today, and I think that though in the short term our economy will suffer, anyone who has dollars, it's a good time to cash them in for pounds. If you're living in the UK, if you're living outside of the UK, it's a good time to hold on to them. I also think that actually in the medium to long term, our economy won't suffer in the medium to long term. And you may be wondering right now, why was I for Remain if none of these things will have a long-term impact? And I'll get to that in a second. Because I think that actually, we've heard from Hazel, and I agree, we can end up being like Norway, and we can end up negotiating a status for Britain that maintains our economic cooperation. It maintains our visa-less status so that there can be free movement. All that really in the end can come from this is that Britain will no longer be bound by the Commission and EU laws. And that's another conversation to have. But I think economically we can negotiate our status with the European Union, and it would be good for both sides to do that. I also don't think that on a migration side that it will have an impact on the security debate. And the reason why is because, as those of us in the field and in the area know, is the overwhelming majority of terrorist attacks have been homegrown. Immigrants are not terrorists. Statistically, it's people like me, born and raised in Britain, who have become homegrown terrorists. It's people like Omar Mateen, born and raised Americans, who have become homegrown terrorists, like the Belgian attackers, like the Paris attackers, and like the 7/7 attackers in London. And so despite all of the scaremongering about immigration, and of course there are legitimate concerns with immigration as well, I don't want to dismiss those who are worried about immigration, I don't think it's going to have an impact on the levels of threat of terrorism that Britain's left, because the levels of threat were always primarily about homegrown, self-starter, what others call lone wolves, I call self-starter terrorists, who have been radicalized due to ideological exposure in the communities, and then further exposure online, and then a trigger event happens, and they conduct an atrocity. Omar Mateen's trigger event was most likely related to his closeted homosexuality in Orlando. But either way, it's about homegrown terrorism looking forward. As Professor Moghadam said, self-starter, highly unpredictable terrorist attacks are what we're going to witness going forward, and that's not going to be affected too much by immigration. So even there, on a negative, I don't think Brexit is going to affect that too much when it comes to the threat levels. So it brings me to what I do think it's going to affect, and why I was for Remain. What I do think it's going to affect is on the culture. Because first and foremost, this was an emotional decision. People voted to leave based on emotional feelings towards what they felt towards a whole bunch of issues, towards immigration, towards Europe, towards bureaucracy, towards regulation and culture. Culture. What they felt being British, being French, being Belgian means. And that's where I want to just dwell for a moment, because where I think the future challenges to not just the terrorism debate, which is the self-starter lone wolf thing, but also to the extremism debate are going to come from, is they're going to come from the rise in identity politics, the rise in populism, and the rise in cultural wars between and within and among communities that self-identify as something and exclude the other as something else. That's where there's going to be a huge challenge going forward, because one of the consequences of globalization has been that some people have embraced being part of the global elite, and others have retreated because they don't feel included in that global elite. They've retreated into the comfortable familiar, and that is the identities of old. And so just like those who voted leave in the United Kingdom, many of them have retreated into what it means to being English, even before what it means to being British. Just like that, many of my fellow Muslims are retreating into the comfortable knowing what it means to be an old-time Muslim, the certainty of that old identity. And we see that happening on the far right. We see that happening within Muslim communities. We see it happening across the world. And so what I really am worried about is the rise of populism and identity politics dividing us. And what I'm worried about is that the Brexit vote last night leads to an increase, an emboldening of populism, an emboldening of identity politics, both in the United Kingdom and then a knock-on effect across Europe and in the United States with the elections there. And there's not much we can do about that. There's not much we can do because the tidal wave of populism right now is so strong. But there is something we can do, and now I want to conclude by asking my fellow Remainers, liberals, that actually the onus is on us even though we lost. The onus is on us to do something that is going to be against our very instincts at this stage, because we're feeling particularly bitter and sad that we lost this vote. But we lost this vote because of years and years of neglect. Neglect of people's concerns around culture and around their identity. And so as a result, there's a backlash that we're witnessing at the moment. How we can deal with that as liberals and Remainers is to acknowledge and recognize that there is genuine hurt about the way in which we have neglected this conversation about identity and culture in the name of ignoring extremism from one aspect of the community. When it comes from, for example, Islamist terrorism, we have one standard. When it comes from far-right terrorists, we have another. Only a consistent standard across the board can help us move beyond this current tidal wave of populism. So if you're on the left wing, don't just talk about far-right extremism. Also talk about Islamist extremism, otherwise you're going to alienate and isolate even more people from the working class communities, for example, those who voted for for leave. If you're on the right wing, don't just talk about Islamist extremism, but also talk about far-right extremism, so that we can start bringing people together. So my appeal is that despite what's happened, this isn't a time of division. This isn't a time for us to turn on each other, but actually it's a time for us, especially on the Remain camp, to embrace the levers and to try and chart a course forward so that we can avoid that populism. and so it doesn't degenerate further into further division. And not only with the European Union, which is also a risk now, but within the United Kingdom, with Scotland and Wales, that division could actually potentially continue. So the onus is on us to respond in a way that shows love, compassion, and mercy, and healing, so that the division is stopped here. And I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.